Hey guys, it's Mike here, and I just saw Godzilla vs. Kong, the ultimate climactic battle of the monsterverse that pitted the two titular monsters against one another in a battle for supremacy. Now, this is a film that's been heavily anticipated by fans of both Godzilla and Kong, especially since they announced that they were building up to this with all of the other films in the monsterverse. As for me, I was more of a fan of the original Japanese Godzilla films and the original King Kong movie, but for the most part, I haven't really liked any of the American versions of them since then. Mostly because I feel like America never really understood the intricacies that go into making a good Godzilla movie, or what the actual appeal of the character in those movies are. But with that being said, I did think it would be fun to see the two of them fight once again with modern technology, so before this film I decided to go and watch all of the other MonsterVerse films and see if they were actually any good. Beginning with Godzilla 2014, which honestly, I wasn't really that big of a fan of. All the stuff with Godzilla himself was pretty interesting and fun to watch, just seeing him rendered with modern technology and CGI, and how powerful and impressive they can make him look. But the rest of the movie was incredibly uninteresting and featuring characters I didn't really care about, especially considering how weird it was to see Aaron Taylor Johnson and Elizabeth Olsen playing a husband and wife, after we had recently seen them playing siblings in the Avengers. But considering how weird things got in the comics, maybe that isn't too far away from the source material. And the fact that they totally squandered Bryan Cranston in his role in the film when he probably should have just been the main character to begin with left a bad taste in my mouth, and I know many other fans. And this is something that's pretty much carried over into the entire franchise of the MonsterVerse, because when we get into the sequel, Godzilla King of the Monsters, the human stuff is actually even worse than the first film, with a ridiculous plot and motivation by the villains, as well as heroes that we don't even care about, including Millie Bobby Brown from Stranger Things. Once again, the stuff with Godzilla fighting against the other monsters like King Ghidorah and Rodan was cool, but pretty much everything else in the movie, which they cut to way too often, was boring and uninteresting. The only movie that I thought had a decent balance here was Kong Skull Island, which I would say is probably the best movie overall of the films that came before Godzilla vs. Kong, doing a somewhat different take on King Kong as a character, and having some fun fights between him and the skull crawlers and other enemies that he fights throughout that movie. But overall, I feel like the MonsterVerse was kind of lackluster going into Godzilla vs. Kong, setting up a kind of formula that for the most part wasn't really that interesting or didn't really work that well. So my anticipation for the fight between the two titans wasn't really that high going in. And upon seeing the movie, I feel like it basically ended up being what I expected. But is that a good or a bad thing? Well, let's get into what happens in this movie, as the plot features what we basically saw in the trailer, where Godzilla is going around the globe attacking certain facilities, and nobody is really sure as to why. However, the humans in this movie seem to have their own trump card that they think will help them deal with Godzilla, which is King Kong, the other titan who has grown even bigger and more powerful by the course of this film. However, does King Kong actually stand a chance against Godzilla, and is there something else that's even greater at play here that's causing Godzilla to act the way he does? Well, naturally, that's explained in the movie. Now, getting into what I liked about this movie, I have to start with just the overall scenes with King Kong, Godzilla, and their fights, which are a lot of fun and pretty much what you would expect in a movie like this, where we see these two towering monsters fighting against one another in an ultimate throwdown in different locations around the world, destroying everything in their path, almost like the Rampage video game. Cities crumble, and the damage that's in Man of Steel seems kind of tame compared to this, as these guys can't even walk around without destroying a few skyscrapers. The movie itself also does a decent job of making King Kong seem like a viable threat against Godzilla when they're fighting, not only making him significantly larger than he was even in Skull Island, but also having him using various tactics as well as his own ape physiology to grab, throw, and just straight up punch Godzilla in the face, which he does repeatedly throughout the film. Although it is clear when you're watching the movie that in overall power, Godzilla is superior, which is something that's generally made up for by the humans who tend to help King Kong during these conflicts, as well as throughout the film, with Kong even eventually getting a weapon that's shown in the trailer. The CGI itself is also good for the most part, which is something that's pretty essential in a movie like this where 99% of what we're seeing is CGI. It's definitely a far cry from the days of guys dressed in costumes punching each other on a set filled with miniatures. Although those older films definitely do have their charm, and ironically tend to show the monsters far more than the American Hollywood versions of these movies. I also really liked all the stuff involving the Hollow Earth in this this movie, which I won't get too much into spoilers of how it comes into play, but as you can see in the trailer, it's one of the coolest parts of the movie. It has a lot of visually striking scenes and moments throughout, as we see Kong kind of going on his own journey and having an arc in which he learns more about his ancestors, and uses what they once had to aid him in his battle against Godzilla. And ultimately, I feel like we'll probably make the audience care more about King Kong than they did at the start of the film. Although much like in the original film, he is presented as being more heroic of a character than Godzilla. But that's probably also because of the fact that it's easier for the audience to relate to a giant ape than it is to a giant lizard. Although I also would have liked to see more focus on Godzilla throughout the course of the film, because sometimes it does feel more like Kong's movie than his, or a shared venture. Also, another thing I have to give the movie credit for is the score by Junkie XL, otherwise known as Tom Holkenborg. He did a really good job with the Snyder Cut, and he did another really good job here. Because if you're gonna have these epic battles between two giant monsters, you might as well have some epic music accompanying it. However, things aren't all positive here, as much like in the other movies, the thing here is that I just did not care about any of the humans or their drama. Sometimes in this film, much like in the other ones, it felt like the humans were on screen so much just to save money on CGI, in which they constantly go back and forth between far too many characters and far too many subplots, involving a number of different small groups of people who are doing their own thing throughout the film, such as the returning Millie Bobby Brown and her group, as well as her father's group, and then there's the one with the little girl from the trailer who's able to speak to Kong using sign language, and their group is pretty much helping him throughout the course of the film. And then of course there is another group comprised of the villains, who overall I feel like are generally weak and don't really have that great of motivation. Not to mention that the overall twist involving them kind of felt like something straight out of Transformers 4, although I did like some of that subplot that pays off in the third act. But overall, I generally don't care about these humans, and I feel like oftentimes they're there either just for scale, or just to pad out the runtime of the film, firing missiles at Godzilla and pointlessly sacrificing themselves, even though we saw in the previous movies that he's basically nuke-proof. It can only really be hurt by other giant monsters, or super ultra weapons that they only used once for some reason. But you could literally cut all the stuff with the humans out except for the very bare minimum, or maybe just cut it down to the single group involving the little girl, and I doubt that any fan will mind. As far as the actual plot goes, it's pretty predictable, and it's basically what I predicted it would be based on the trailers that we saw. Now, whether or not that's a fault of the trailer or the movie itself, I mean, that's really up to you, but don't be surprised if the plot is basically exactly what you think it is going in. And also, after all of that, I did feel like the ending was kind of abrupt. It felt like there was a little bit more to wrap up in the story or perhaps explain after the events of the film, but in the middle of doing that, they kind of just cut to black. There also wasn't even an end credit scene here, which I think they had in pretty much all of the other MonsterVerse movies so far. Maybe they were just trying to follow suit from Avengers Endgame and felt like they didn't need anything afterward, but I doubt that this is going to be the end of the franchise by any means, so it would have made sense to try and set something up, and at least capitalize on all of the people that are watching this movie. Now, when it comes to this version of Godzilla vs. Kong, does it stand up against the original? I would have to say so. I wasn't really that big of a fan of the original one even as a kid, and I thought it was way too unrealistic for Kong to be able to fight Godzilla, even with the random electric powers that they gave him, which I think was a holdover of when Frankenstein was originally supposed to be in that movie. In this movie, I think that they deliver better on the concept, and they give us more of a definitive ending between the two. As far as the other MonsterVerse movies go, I would say either this or Kong Skull Island is probably the best of the bunch. Again, I didn't really like the original two Godzilla movies that they did for this franchise, so it only had the option of going up from there. And I think that aside from the stuff with the humans, it tended to do that. Now, as far as actually going to see this movie, should you see it in theaters or should you watch on HBO Max? Personally, I watched it on HBO Max, as none of my local theaters are really open. However, with that being said, I do think that this probably would benefit from seeing it on theaters on the biggest screen you can, with the Dolby Atmos audio that it was mixed in. If you don't really want to do that right now, it's totally understandable, but overall for the best viewing experience, I feel like you probably would be best in seeing it on a big screen. So overall, Godzilla vs. Kong is just about what you would expect from this franchise. The movie delivers on the fight between the two monsters, as well as some other monsters along the way, giving you pretty much your money's worth of what you're looking for, but pretty much everything else in the movie is uninteresting and just generally boring. If you've seen the other movies and you're a big fan of either Godzilla, Kong, or both, or if you just want to see a big popcorn movie where giant monsters monsters fight each other, then you should check it out. Although I honestly wouldn't blame you at all for fast-forwarding to the good parts. That's what I'll probably do if I ever rewatch this, or just do other stuff in the background when the humans are on screen. After all, it's not like anyone's watching this thing for the story. Make sure to subscribe and enable all notifications, so you can stay up to date with all of my videos. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.